Imagine a land once brimming with grandeur and sophistication. Roman Britain, a thriving province of the great Roman Empire. Picture bustling cities, luxurious villas adorned with intricate mosaics, well-paved roads that connected every corner of the empire, and the hum of trade, culture, and military might. But then, without warning, this world comes to an abrupt halt. The legions, once the iron fist of Rome, depart. The forts are abandoned, the cities left to fall into disrepair. The protection of the empire is no more, and Britain is left vulnerable to the tides of time and the incoming storm of new forces. In the void left behind by Rome's departure, a new chapter begins to unfold. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and the forging of a new identity. A story of people who had once been nothing more than mercenaries, yet would soon rise to shape the future of Britain itself. This is the story of the Anglo-Saxons, warriors, settlers, and rulers who would redefine a land and its people. But the road to power was not an easy one. The Anglo-Saxons would first have to contend with a broken, war-torn Britain and the remnants of its former rulers. They would face battles not only against the remnants of the Romanized Britons, but also against the ever-looming threat of invaders from beyond the seas. Their story would be one of constant struggle, shifting allegiances, and ultimate triumph, an indelible mark on the landscape of British history.
Welcome back to The History Guy. In today's video, I will take you through the fascinating timeline of the Anglo-Saxons, starting with the fall of Roman Britain, their arrival as mercenaries, and their gradual rise to power. We'll explore the formation of the early kingdoms, the Viking invasions that shaped their destiny, and the lasting legacy they left on England. As we dive into their story, I want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to know why. Let us know in the comments and we'll be sure to engage. Then just the presence of Roman soldiers. For over 300 years, Britain had been a part of the vast Roman Empire, a world of order, Roman law, and sophisticated infrastructure. For the average Roman citizen, whether a soldier, merchant, or landowner, life was structured by the rhythm of the empire. The cities, grand in scale and purpose, stood as beacons of Roman civilization. Londinium, the capital, was a bustling urban hub where commerce, culture, and administration intersected. At the heart of these urban centers were the public baths. More than just places of hygiene, they were social institutions, hubs for gathering, networking, and relaxing. The Forum was the pulse of Roman political life, where debates and decrees shaped the daily lives of people. Merchants and traders from across the empire flocked to Britain's thriving markets, where exotic goods like wine, olive oil, and fine pottery were traded. Meanwhile, in the countryside, sprawling villas adorned with mosaics and frescoes served as reminders of the wealth and affluence that came with Roman rule. The structures weren't just places of residence, they were statements of Roman identity, monuments to the empire's power and reach. Beyond material wealth, Roman Britain was held together by a complex web of social structures. The patrician families, often of Roman descent, held the reins of power in both the political and economic arenas. While the lower classes, peasants, laborers, and slaves, performed the hard labor that kept the wheels of society turning, it was the aristocracy that reaped the rewards. Roman law, grounded in concepts like citizenship, legal representation, and property rights, formed the basis for daily life and governance. This was a world where there was order, security, and continuity.
Yet all of this was to be undone by the withdrawal of the Roman legions. The decision to pull out wasn't sudden, nor was it universally agreed upon. The political turmoil in Rome, instability in the emperor's court, pressures from barbarian invasions on the continent, and the financial burdens of maintaining a distant province led to the eventual abandonment of Britain. In 410 CE, the legions departed for the final time. The general populace, caught between the stability of the Roman Empire and the sudden void left by its absence, was left to reckon with an uncertain future. Consider a Roman nobleman, perhaps of the same ilk as Gaius Julius, watching as the legions marched away. The streets of his villa, once teeming with the activity of soldiers and traders, were eerily quiet. The stone walls, built to protect him from the elements and invaders alike, suddenly felt fragile. The once grand procession of Roman officials and their attendants, so familiar, had vanished. The Roman standard, which once waved proudly over military fortifications and ceremonial events, was no longer visible on the horizon. Gaius, like many aristocrats, had always taken for granted the strength and protection afforded by Roman rule. His estate, sprawling across the rolling hills of the British countryside, had flourished under the secure and predictable governance of the empire. The roads, paved in Roman stone, had allowed goods to flow from port to town, from town to villa. Now, these same roads seemed to lead into an uncertain, disintegrating future. The loss was not just political, it was personal. His wealth, once tied to the empire's might, was now vulnerable to the whims of the local tribes and new powers vying for control. The aristocrats were not alone in their grief. For the common folk, the withdrawal of Roman troops was the end of a centuries-long security. The imperial legions had not only guarded the land, but had also helped maintain order. Without them, there were no guarantees, no assurance that their villages, towns, and farms would remain safe from invaders. For these Britons, there was the dawning realization that they would have to face an unpredictable and hostile world on their own. The shadow of Rome was gone, and in its place, uncertainty loomed. The departure of the Roman legions unleashed a rapid series of shifts across Britain's political and social landscape. With the centralized Roman bureaucracy dismantled, there was no longer a unifying authority to hold the provinces together. The imperial structures that had governed and stabilized Britain now lay in ruins. The roads, once the veins of Roman Britain, now lay vulnerable to the forces of nature and neglect. Towns like Londinium, once bustling with commerce and culture, began to decline as the wealthy departed and the walls were left unmanned.
In the absence of Rome's structured authority, the Britons turned inward. Local leaders, chiefs, warlords, and merchants began to take up the mantle of power. It was a time of fragmentation, where regions could no longer rely on Rome's protective umbrella. What followed was the rise of local power dynamics, with regional tribal leaders asserting control over their territories. For the aristocrats like Gaius, the question of power was no longer theoretical, it was existential. The role of landowner and nobleman had to be redefined in the face of local tribal leaders and opportunistic warlords. What was once a cohesive society, held together by Roman law, military power, and the might of the emperor, began to splinter into rival factions, with no clear ruler at the helm. Communities that had once enjoyed the stability of the Roman Empire were now left to navigate this chaos alone. Even religious life, which had been increasingly Christianized under Roman rule, began to fracture. With the absence of the empire's influence, the growth of Christianity slowed, and pagan traditions gained a renewed foothold. Britain, once a proud province of the mighty Roman Empire, now stood at a crossroads. Without the security of Roman soldiers, the once stable economic system, the powerful political framework, and the centralized culture, Britain was forced to look inward and adapt. This was the beginning of a new era,
one of uncertainty, struggle, and ultimately, transformation. The Anglo-Saxons would soon make their mark, but not before Britain endured the chaos that came with the loss of Rome's guiding hand. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. What had once been a cohesive, powerful force, the supreme empire in the Western world, was now a shell of its former self, torn apart by internal conflicts, economic strain, and the unrelenting pressure of barbarian invasions. The political climate in Rome itself was one of constant upheaval. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, their reigns often short-lived and marked by assassination, betrayal, and civil war. There was no longer the stability that had once been the bedrock of Roman rule.
The decline of the Roman Empire in the West didn't happen in a single cataclysmic event. Rather, it was the result of centuries of decline, each year chipping away at the foundations. The 4th and early 5th centuries were defined by a series of weak emperors, each struggling to maintain control over an increasingly fractured empire. The throne of Rome had become a precarious seat. Emperors were not chosen by merit or lineage, but by political maneuvering and military strength. A general, a senator, or even a local commander could, with enough support, seize the throne. Take, for example, the Emperor Maximus, who in 383 led a revolt against the Western Emperor Gratian, marking the beginning of a period in which the position of emperor became increasingly unstable. Political power was no longer centered in the hands of one ruler. It was fragmented between competing military factions and ambitious generals. Emperors like Honorius, who would be the last to rule the Western Empire before its ultimate fall, were often seen as little more than figureheads, powerless against the rising tide of invasions and internal strife. As these emperors were engaged in deadly struggles for power, the Roman military, once the finest in the world, began to crumble under the weight of its own logistical and financial problems. The empire's vast borders, which had once been effectively defended by legions stationed from Hispania to Mesopotamia, were now vulnerable. The cost of maintaining such a sprawling empire was astronomical, and as Rome's treasury depleted, so too did the empire's ability to support its military. The soldiers, once a loyal and disciplined force, became mere mercenaries, soldiers who fought not for the glory of Rome, but for pay, and whose loyalty could be easily swayed. This was particularly evident on the frontiers, where the relentless pressure from barbarian groups, Goths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks, was increasingly felt. The empire's resources were stretched thin as the legions in the east were forced to concentrate their efforts on defending the empire's core. Meanwhile, the Western Empire, whose territories extended to the very edges of Europe, could do little more than fend off attacks. And it was in this environment that Britain, a province already on the periphery of the empire, found itself increasingly vulnerable. Britain, isolated by its geography and with a military stretched ever thinner, was one of the first provinces to feel the brunt of the Roman Empire's weakening grip. By 383 CE, Emperor Maximus, in a desperate attempt to defend the empire from growing threats, took legions stationed in Britain to reinforce his forces in Gaul, leaving the island exposed. The withdrawal of the legions was not immediate, but a gradual process. Over the following decades, as the empire continued to falter, more and more Roman soldiers were pulled from the island, leaving Britain defenseless against the tribes to the north and the raiders from across the sea. At first, the British were told that the withdrawal was only temporary, a strategic realignment of resources. The legions, after all, had been a powerful symbol of Roman might. But as months turned into years, it became increasingly clear that the empire was no longer able or willing to provide the protection it once had. As the last legions left the shores of Britain, it was not just a military departure, it was a seismic shift in the fabric of British life. The military infrastructure that had once been the backbone of Roman Britain began to erode. Roman fortifications, which had once dotted the landscape from Hadrian's Wall to the southern coast, began to fall into ruin.
The walls that had stood as symbols of Roman strength now stood empty and silent, slowly overtaken by nature. The roads that had once been the arteries of the Roman Empire, linking settlements and facilitating trade and communication, began to degrade. The high standards of Roman construction, built to last for centuries, still stood, but they were left untended, neglected in the absence of the legions who had once maintained them. What had once been a military network that ensured peace now stood as a broken remnant, a reminder of Rome's former glory. Without the presence of the legions, the island's defenses collapsed. The Britons, many of whom had never known anything other than Roman rule, were suddenly thrust into a new reality, one in which they were expected to fend for themselves. The Britons, once accustomed to the stability and order brought by Roman law, found themselves facing threats from within and without. The Saxons, Jutes, and Angles, tribes from across the sea, began to raid and settle in the lands left defenseless by Rome's withdrawal. To the north, the Picts and Scots pressed ever harder against Hadrian's Wall, which had once served as a formidable line of defense. As these external threats grew, Britain's internal political structure, weakened by years of Roman neglect, failed to mount an effective defense. At the same time, the economic consequences of the military drawdown became painfully evident. Trade, which had flourished under Roman rule, began to stagnate. The lack of Roman presence made it harder for Britons to protect merchants or maintain the vast network of trade routes that had once connected Britain to the wider Roman world. As the island's wealth dried up, the aristocracy, once content in their Romanized existence, began to lose their grip on power. Without the protection of the legions or the financial support from Rome, many of the noble families began to retreat, leaving their estates vulnerable to raiders and internecine strife. The final blow came in 410 CE, when the Emperor Honorius officially abandoned Britain. No longer able to defend its farthest provinces, Rome acknowledged what had long been clear: Britain was no longer part of the empire. The military and political infrastructure that had once tied Britain to Rome crumbled in a final, irreversible collapse. Without the empire's support, Britain was now a fractured land, isolated from the great power it had once belonged to. Thus, the withdrawal of the Roman legions didn't just signify the departure of soldiers, it marked the end of an era. Britain, which had once flourished under the rule of Rome, was now cast adrift in a turbulent world. The once great empire, which had brought stability, culture, and law to the island, had abandoned its province, leaving it to face a new era of uncertainty, chaos, and invasion. And as the Roman authority dissolved into the mists of history, the Anglo-Saxons, eager for new lands to conquer, would soon rise to fill the power vacuum left in their wake.
The legions were Rome's greatest weapon, a symbol of the empire's unyielding authority. In Britain, their presence had been both literal and metaphorical. The soldiers were the muscle of Roman civilization, ensuring that the province remained firmly under imperial control. Their shields, their discipline, and their watchful eyes had kept the edges of the empire safe, and in doing so, they maintained a world that seemed as though it could last forever. But that world was about to shatter. As the Roman legions withdrew from Britain, it wasn't as though the empire fell overnight. The process had been slow and drawn out, a series of decisions made over decades, each one pushing Britain further from the grasp of Rome. The withdrawal wasn't the dramatic spectacle that one might imagine. Instead, it was a slow and insidious departure. First, a trickle of soldiers pulled back to defend more pressing threats elsewhere. Then entire legions moved to other parts of the empire, leaving Britain to fend for itself. For the people of Roman Britain, each departing soldier, each empty barrack, each silent fort left behind in the hills, was a nail in the coffin of their civilization. Imagine, if you will, being a Roman citizen in Britain at this time,
Perhaps you had lived your whole life under the shadow of the Roman Empire, where Roman soldiers had always been present. You had witnessed firsthand the security and certainty that Rome had provided. The roads were safe to travel, trade flowed smoothly, and the empire's presence was felt in every part of your life, from the laws you followed, to the language you spoke, to the gods you prayed to. Yet as the legions departed, you would have felt something far worse than fear. It was the creeping realization that everything you had taken for granted was slipping away. Without the legions, your once safe world was now exposed. The departure wasn't a battle. There was no grand fight, no rallying cry to save the empire. Instead, it was the absence, the hollow sound of footsteps no longer marching along the roads, the eerie quiet in the cities as the soldiers vanished. There was no great farewell. There was only the slow erosion of everything that had made Britain Roman. For those who had grown up in the empire, this wasn't just the loss of soldiers, it was the loss of a way of life. The stability, the wealth, the legal protections provided by Roman rule began to feel like a dream fading into memory.
When the legions left, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The structure of Roman Britain had been built on the military prowess of the empire. The legions weren't just defenders, they were the enforcers of Roman law, the administrators of Roman rule, and the builders of Roman infrastructure. Their absence created a vacuum that no one was ready to fill. The British were no strangers to military conflict, but they had grown accustomed to the might of Rome. The legions had been a constant presence on the frontiers, patrolling the roads, keeping order, and ensuring that Britain remained a part of the empire. But now, with no soldiers to maintain order, the country quickly became fractured. Towns and villages that had once been protected by the Roman military were left to fend for themselves. The roads that had once allowed for the safe movement of goods and soldiers now became dangerous paths for bandits, raiders, and marauding tribes. To the north, the Picts and Scots, who had always been a thorn in the empire's side, now saw an opportunity. The walls that had once separated them from Roman Britain were no longer manned, and they began to press further into the land. The Saxons, whose ships had long circled the coastlines, saw that Britain was now an easy target. With no legions to defend the shores, they began to raid more frequently, launching attacks on towns and cities along the coast. The immediate impact on the civilian population was stark. For the Romanized Britons who had lived their lives under the protections of Roman law, this period must have felt like a plunge into chaos. Without Roman officials to enforce the laws, local leaders struggled to maintain control. What had once been a highly organized society quickly devolved into smaller, fractured communities. Some towns and cities resorted to local militias, but without the training or discipline of Roman soldiers, these makeshift forces could do little to stem the tide of chaos. What happened to the grand villas and public buildings of Roman Britain tells a story of a society in flux, a civilization falling apart. The villas, which had once been symbols of Roman luxury and power, began to deteriorate. These lavish homes, adorned with fine mosaics, frescoes, and courtyards, were built to withstand centuries. Yet, without the support of Roman infrastructure and resources, they quickly fell into ruin. The aristocrats who once inhabited these homes now faced a grim reality. Without the empire's backing, they could no longer afford to maintain their estates. Some of these villas were abandoned altogether, their opulent rooms left to rot. Others were repurposed, their grand hallways turned into shelters for refugees, or their mosaics covered up to make room for more practical designs. The once beautiful gardens, meticulously laid out by Roman landscapers, became overgrown, as nature slowly reclaimed what had once been a symbol of Roman control and civilization.
The public buildings, such as basilicas, forums, and amphitheaters, fared no better. These grand structures had once been the heart of Roman public life, places where justice was administered, trade took place, and citizens gathered for entertainment. But with the legions gone, the people were left without the means to maintain these monumental buildings. The forums became silent, their columns crumbling. The amphitheaters, once filled with the cheers of Roman citizens watching gladiators, fell into disrepair, their grand stages empty. In some cases, the remaining Britons found ways to reuse these structures. The grand villas, once symbols of Roman wealth, were stripped for their materials, stone, wood, and tile. The Roman baths, which had been centers of social life, were abandoned, their waters still, but their walls still strong enough to be used for other purposes. What had once been the grandeur of Roman Britain was now repurposed, not for culture, but for survival. The memory of Roman civilization, so carefully constructed over centuries, now lay in tatters, a faint echo of a once great empire. By the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain, the island had already witnessed the slow unraveling of its Roman identity. The legions, once the backbone of British security, had been withdrawn, leaving the land vulnerable to external and internal threats. Britain was a fractured and uncertain place. The Romanized Britons, those who had grown up under the relative peace of the Roman Empire, now found themselves in the midst of power struggles, both from within and without. The Picts, to the north, emboldened by the absence of Roman control, began to push against the remnants of Hadrian's Wall, a symbol of Roman might that had stood as a barrier between the Britons and the fierce northern tribes for centuries. From the sea, the Saxons and Jutes launched increasing raids along the southern coastlines. Britain was no longer a unified, thriving province of the Roman Empire. Instead, it had become a land of isolation, beset on all sides by hostile forces, with no central authority to maintain order. The economy was in disarray, and local leaders struggled to protect their people and their lands.
It was in this climate of chaos that the Saxons first came to Britain, not as invaders, but as mercenaries. They were hired by the Britons to defend against the increasingly aggressive raids and incursions. They had been hired before, and their presence was seen as a temporary solution to a temporary problem. Yet, what began as a few mercenary bands hired for defense would soon transform into something far more permanent. For the Romano-British elites, the arrival of the Saxons was a bitter pill. At first, there was a sense of relief. These warrior tribes were fierce, skilled, and more importantly, they had the strength to defend Britain against its enemies. But there was a deeper, more insidious worry lurking beneath the surface. These warriors were foreign. They were not Roman. They didn't share the same cultural norms or loyalty to the Romanized systems that had structured life in Britain for centuries. For the aristocracy, who had once ruled over their estates in the fashion of their Roman predecessors, the Saxons were a reminder of how fragile their power had become. The military forces they had relied upon for so long were no longer theirs to command. Now they were forced to depend on these foreign, independent fighters whose loyalty to the British cause was always uncertain. The first Saxon settlements in Britain were small and humble, camps and fortified settlements near the coastline where they could maintain access to supplies and easy communication with their homelands across the sea. These were not the grand, permanent settlements we think of when we imagine the Saxons' eventual rule. Instead, they were basic outposts, places where the Saxons could rest, regroup, and prepare for battle. In these early days, the Saxons were seen largely as mercenaries, fighters for hire. The Romano-British elites welcomed them at first, providing land and resources in exchange for their protection. But while the Saxons were initially welcomed as outsiders hired for a specific task, their long-term presence began to disrupt the fragile balance of power. These initial Saxon settlements often existed at the edges of Romano-British towns, separated by both culture and purpose. The Britons, having been shaped by Roman laws, customs, and religion, struggled to understand the fierce, egalitarian society the Saxons had built. For the Saxons, who had been raised in a warrior culture, their values were at odds with the Romanized way of life in Britain.
In many ways, this division was practical. The Saxons, initially focusing on their military duties, were reluctant to engage in the more sedentary civic life that the Romanized Britons cherished. But as the Saxon settlements grew in size and permanence, the division between the two groups began to blur. Over time, the Saxons began to take more land, pushing further inland, and soon their villages began to flourish, not just as outposts, but as small burgeoning kingdoms in their own right.
The relationship between the Saxons and the Britons, initially based on mutual necessity, began to shift. The Saxons, first hired to protect, now began to settle, and in doing so, they began to challenge the status quo. Some Britons saw the Saxons as a necessary force for survival, an ally against the rampaging Picts, Scots, and Saxons from across the sea. Others saw them as a threat to their authority, a potential new ruling class that would eventually dominate the landscape of Britain. Over time, the uneasy truce between the Saxons and the Britons gave way to open conflict, as both groups vied for control over land and resources. The question of why the Saxons came to Britain is more complex than the simple answer that they came as mercenaries. While the lure of land and riches certainly played a significant role, the Saxons were also motivated by broader socio-political forces. For one, the Saxon homelands were facing increasing pressure from rival tribes. The lands to the east and south of their territory were becoming overcrowded and increasingly unstable. The need for new land, new opportunities, and new sources of wealth was a powerful motivator for the Saxons. But their migration to Britain was also part of a much larger Germanic migration that had been sweeping through Europe. As the Roman Empire crumbled, it left a vacuum that the Germanic tribes were eager to fill. The fall of the Western Roman Empire left a power vacuum across Europe, and tribes like the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes sought to capitalize on this instability. Britain, with its relative wealth, fertile lands, and strategic position, became an attractive target. For the Saxons, Britain represented a new frontier, a land to conquer, settle, and build anew. Moreover, the Saxons were not simply motivated by economic gain. They were driven by their own cultural and social imperatives. The warrior culture of the Saxons placed great emphasis on conquest and expansion. The desire for glory, for a place in the annals of history, drove many Saxons to seek out new lands to conquer. The challenges of survival and the opportunity to carve out their own kingdoms, free from the political constraints of their homelands, were powerful motivators for these people. In the early days, it was economic opportunity and survival that brought the Saxons to Britain. But as they settled, their motivations began to evolve. What began as a pragmatic military solution became something more, an ambition for power, land, and legacy. The Saxons were not merely mercenaries in a foreign land. They were the beginning of a new era for Britain, one that would eventually lead to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain marked the beginning of an era of transformation. The early Saxon settlements were far from the grand cities that had defined Roman Britain. Initially, these settlements were small and pragmatic, founded by mercenary bands who had been brought in to defend the land against growing threats. These new arrivals, hailing from the Germanic tribes of northern Europe, were practical and adaptive. They brought with them a culture centered around survival, kinship, and warfare, a stark contrast to the Romanized life that had been carefully cultivated in Britain for centuries. The first Saxon settlements were typically located near the coastlines, where they could keep in contact with the homeland and secure their trade routes. But these early villages were more than just military camps. They were the seeds of something new. The Saxons quickly learned to adapt to the British landscape, which, though fertile, was far different from the land they had left behind in the north. They cleared forests for farmland, built simple yet sturdy wooden houses, and established communities that were tightly knit by blood and shared survival.
Unlike the Romans, whose cities were meticulously planned and often built in stone, the Saxons made use of readily available materials, wood, thatch, and wattle, creating longhouses designed to provide warmth and shelter for large extended families. These longhouses, the hallmark of Saxon architecture, were rectangular buildings with steep thatched roofs. They were designed with practicality in mind, able to withstand the damp British climate. But more importantly, they reflected the communal and familial values of the Saxons. Inside, families would live alongside their livestock, sharing the warmth of the hearth. This structure mirrored the Saxon worldview. Survival was communal, and strength was found in the bonds between kin and tribe. Over time, these simple settlements grew in size and complexity. As the Saxons continued to expand inland, they began to lay the foundations for a more permanent, self-sustaining society.
At the same time, the Saxons' arrival marked a clear departure from the Roman way of life. The Roman-built villas that had once dotted the British landscape were now abandoned, crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The Romans had built cities with grand forums, bathhouses, and administrative centers, symbols of their sophisticated bureaucratic empire. In contrast, the Saxons brought with them a different kind of governance, one that was decentralized, focused on individual leaders and warrior bands. The Saxons established chieftains and kings, often chosen for their prowess in battle and their ability to inspire loyalty from their followers. Roman laws and bureaucracy were gradually replaced by more immediate, personal systems of justice, governed by the leaders of these warrior tribes. The shift from Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon Britain was not just physical, but cultural. The sophistication of Roman life, the art, the architecture, the structured society, was replaced by the raw, warrior-driven culture of the Saxons. For the Romanized Britons who had lived under Roman rule, this change would have been stark and unsettling. The quiet, orderly life they had known, built around Roman ideals of citizenship, law, and civilization, was now a distant memory. In its place stood a society where strength, loyalty, and kinship were paramount. For the Saxons, civilization was defined not by the luxuries of Roman life, but by their warrior code and their connection to the land. They did not build stone temples or public baths. Instead, they constructed the longhouses that served as both home and community center. The Romans, with their grand architecture and civic pride, would have viewed these modest structures as primitive, yet the Saxons viewed them as the heart of their world. The Roman baths, with their elaborate heating systems, faded into memory, replaced by the simple, functional structures of Saxon life. Roman roads, once meticulously maintained and traveled, began to fall into disrepair as the Saxons focused on building their own small-scale infrastructure to connect their settlements. Romanized Britons, particularly the elites, found this cultural shift difficult to swallow. Many of the upper classes had adopted Roman customs, speaking Latin, dressing in Roman fashion, and living in Roman-style villas. The idea of abandoning these cultural markers in favor of a simpler, more rugged way of life would have been painful. Yet the Saxons did not completely discard the Roman presence. They lived among the ruins of Roman Britain, and their interactions with these remnants were not purely dismissive. Some Saxons repurposed Roman materials, using Roman brick and stone to build their own structures, while others adapted Roman knowledge in practical ways, from agricultural techniques to military organization. Over time, some of the Roman legacy would be incorporated into Saxon society, though it was reshaped to fit the needs and values of the new settlers. The Saxons, however, did not embrace Roman law or the complexities of Roman governance. Instead, they brought their own system, a system based on personal loyalty to leaders and the importance of kinship. This shift created a less centralized form of power, one based more on local chieftains and warbands than on bureaucratic structures. The Roman ideal of a unified, structured society gave way to a more fractured yet fiercely independent world. At the center of this new Anglo-Saxon society stood the Mead Hall. More than just a building, the Mead Hall was the heart of Saxon social, political, and cultural life.
It was here that leaders met with their warriors to plan campaigns, distribute rewards, and share in the spoils of victory. It was a space where the bonds of kinship were reaffirmed, where loyalty to one's lord was cemented in ritual and practice. The mead hall was a large, open structure, typically built of wood and thatch, and often situated at the center of the settlement. Its hearth was the symbolic and literal heart of the community, providing warmth and light during long winters. Inside, warriors and their families gathered for feasts, where mead, the drink of kings, was shared. It was in these halls that the bonds of loyalty were strengthened through speech and song, where the leader's prowess was celebrated and the deeds of ancestors were retold. The hall was not just a building, it was a place of identity, where the Saxons gathered to celebrate their values of courage, loyalty, and strength. For the Saxons, the mead hall was also a symbol of the power of the leader. A warrior chief could only hold power if he had the loyalty of his followers, and the mead hall was the place where that loyalty was solidified. The leader's ability to host feasts, provide for his warriors, and protect the community was judged by the size and success of the gatherings held within the mead hall. As a result, these halls were centers of influence, and their construction and upkeep were vital to maintaining the social and political order of the Saxon settlements.
In time, the mead hall became more than just a symbol of power. It became a repository of history and culture. The songs sung in the hall, the stories told around the fire, and the artifacts passed down through generations all contributed to the Saxon sense of identity and purpose. The mead hall was the place where the past was remembered and the future was shaped. When the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and Angles began to make their presence felt on the shores of Britain, it was not the arrival of a single unified invasion, but a gradual and opportunistic process that unfolded over decades. These groups did not simply appear as conquerors, they were more often raiders, mercenaries, and eventually settlers, arriving in waves that would continue to reshape Britain's social and political landscape for centuries. The first waves of Saxon invasions in the 5th century were driven primarily by the search for land and resources, essentially a quest for survival. In their homelands in what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and southern Scandinavia, the Saxons faced a growing pressure from other tribes. Overpopulation, limited land, and frequent internal conflicts made their homeland increasingly inhospitable. In contrast, Britain, recently abandoned by its Roman rulers, appeared rich in resources, yet weak and fragmented. The Romans had left Britain with its defenses weakened, and it was a land ripe for new settlers looking for fertile soil and unclaimed land. The early Saxon incursions were marked by quick, opportunistic raids, often landing on the southern coasts. They were not looking for full-scale conquest in the beginning, but were instead seeking to carve out footholds. For the Saxons, these early raids were a mixture of plunder and settlement. Their ships, agile and fast, enabled them to strike swiftly, plunder what they could, and retreat before any substantial resistance could gather. But as these raids became more frequent, they evolved. It was no longer about quick plunder, it became about taking and holding land. Saxon families began to establish settlements, not just raiding for wealth, but laying the foundations for long-term occupation. For the Britons, these early invasions were not just a series of skirmishes, they were a moment of profound vulnerability. The Britons had become accustomed to the Roman way of life, relying on Roman military might for protection and structure. With the Roman withdrawal, Britain was left without a centralized defense system. The early invasions caught the Britons off guard. Their society was fragmented, with local leaders fighting for power in the absence of Roman rule. What followed was a series of desperate, fragmented attempts to repel the invaders. In these first years, the Britons found themselves at a disadvantage,
lacking the unified military command that had once made Roman Britain formidable. This was not just a conflict over land, it was a battle over the survival of Britain's legacy. The Saxons, with their warrior culture and relentless drive, were determined to establish their own presence on this land, a presence that would eventually push the Romano-Britons out of the picture entirely. The British response to the Saxon raids was fragmented at best. Without the organization of the Roman military, the Britons lacked the ability to mount a cohesive defense. Instead, they relied on local militias and tribal leaders, but these forces were poorly organized and poorly equipped. The Britons still held on to Roman-style fortifications, particularly along the coastline, but without the discipline of Roman soldiers to man them, these defenses were easily breached by the quick-moving Saxon warriors. The British towns, once teeming with the structures and order of Roman civilization, were now left vulnerable. The remnants of Roman walls were no match for the Saxon strategy of fast, hard strikes followed by retreat. Many towns fell with little resistance, as the Britons, still recovering from the shock of Roman abandonment, lacked the unified military might to face this new threat. Even when they did organize for defense, it was often too late, and without the leadership of a single unifying force, the Britons' efforts lacked coordination. In the face of such challenges, the Britons were left with few options. Some sought to create alliances with neighboring tribes, like the Picts or the Scots, but these were often short-lived or ineffective. The British defense was marked by a reactive rather than proactive strategy. Each local leader faced a different set of circumstances, which meant the British resistance to the Saxon advance was scattered and uneven. There were no unified military campaigns, no great battles fought in the open field, just a series of small, isolated skirmishes that often ended in defeat. In contrast, the Saxons were able to coordinate their attacks and settlements. Their society, though new to Britain, was already shaped by centuries of warrior culture. They operated with a high degree of mobility and flexibility, striking where they could and retreating before the Britons could organize a counterattack. Their use of longships allowed them to cover vast distances quickly, moving in and out of the British coastline with ease. Their tactics were rooted in mobility, surprise, and an understanding of how to exploit weaknesses in the British defense. Throughout the early period of the Anglo-Saxon invasions, several key figures emerged who would play pivotal roles in shaping the course of the conflict. On the British side, Vortigern is perhaps the most notable figure. A leader of the Romano-British aristocracy, Vortigern's decision to hire Saxon mercenaries to defend Britain against external threats ultimately led to the Saxons' permanent presence on the island. Vortigern's initial attempts to use Saxon warriors as allies were ultimately a miscalculation. Though he saw the Saxons as a temporary measure, the Saxons quickly established their own stronghold in Britain, seizing land and power in the process. Vortigern's failure to maintain control over these mercenaries marked the beginning of the end for Roman Britain. On the Saxon side, Hengist and Horsa were the primary leaders behind the initial invasions. Hengist, in particular, became a symbol of the Saxon determination to claim Britain as their own. According to legend and early historical sources, Hengist and Horsa were invited to Britain by Vortigern as mercenaries, but they quickly turned their swords on the Britons, using the chaos of the post-Roman world to carve out their own territory. Hengist, known for his strategic mind and ruthless ambition, was instrumental in leading the Saxons from mercenaries to conquerors. His ability to unite various Saxon tribes under a single cause allowed the Saxons to press their advantage. The Saxon tactics, led by Hengist and Horsa, were centered around quick, brutal strikes, often in the form of coastal raids. They used their longships to travel quickly and unpredictably, making it difficult for the Britons to prepare a defense. When Hengist and his forces first entered Britain, they relied on surprise and shock, attacking vulnerable targets along the coast before retreating back to their ships. Over time, however, their tactics evolved. They began to establish more permanent strongholds, using British land to settle their people and cement their claim on the island. The early Anglo-Saxon invasions were marked by opportunistic raids and a series of small but significant battles for control over land and resources. The Saxons' strategic advantages, combined with the Britons' lack of a unified defense, allowed them to establish a foothold that would lead to their eventual domination of Britain. Leaders like Vortigern and Hengist shaped the early stages of the conflict, with each side employing different tactics and approaches. The Saxons' success in Britain was not just about military power, it was about adaptability, surprise, and the ability to build strongholds in a fractured land. These early invasions set the stage for the Saxon settlement of Britain, a turning point in the island's history. The birth of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain was not an inevitable monolithic event. It was a slow, deliberate process driven by necessity, survival, and opportunity. Following the departure of the Roman legions and the collapse of centralized rule, Britain had become a patchwork of competing powers, all struggling to stake their claim on a land left in disarray. For the Anglo-Saxons, comprising mainly the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, this chaotic environment provided fertile ground for establishing kingdoms, but the path to kingdom building was far from straightforward. At first, these early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not so much established as they were shaped by their circumstances. Wessex, Kent, and Northumbria were born from the necessity to consolidate power, resources, and land in the face of internal divisions and external threats. The Saxons didn't just bring military prowess to Britain. They brought adaptability, a keen sense of opportunity, and the ability to build strongholds in a fractured land. Wessex, situated in the south, was a kingdom that thrived on a combination of strategic location and military strength. It rose from the fertile farmlands and dense forests of the south, taking advantage of its proximity to the continent. But Wessex's success was not purely due to its geographic advantages. It was the result of continuous battles and alliances, the formation of a warrior society that valued loyalty, and a series of capable leaders who could unite their people. Unlike the fragmented, isolated communities that dotted Roman Britain, Wessex's survival depended on its ability to integrate new settlers, forge alliances with neighboring tribes, and slowly build a powerful kingdom. Kent, to the east, was a kingdom shaped by its access to the continent and its early adoption of Christianity. The Kentish kings, notably Ethelbert, saw the value of aligning with the growing Christian church. This was not merely a religious shift, it was a political one. By embracing Christianity, Ethelbert cemented his authority and established diplomatic ties with the Pope and the Christian kingdoms of Europe, especially the Franks. Kent's position as an early adopter of Christianity allowed it to lead the way in both religious and political realms, setting it apart from its neighbors. Northumbria, located in the north, emerged from the union of two kingdoms, Bernicia in the north and Deira in the south. Northumbria's geographic location, stretching across the northern heartland of Britain, gave it access to vast resources and strategic trade routes. It was the kingdom with the greatest cultural and intellectual influence in early Anglo-Saxon Britain, due in part to its strong religious and monastic centers, such as Lindisfarne. Northumbria, however, wasn't simply a land of religious fervor. It was a land of constant warfare and territorial expansion, with kings like Oswald and Oswiu pushing for dominance in the north and beyond. These kingdoms didn't rise in isolation. Rather, their fates were intertwined by war, alliance, and trade. The foundations of Wessex, Kent, and Northumbria were built on the fierce desire for control over land, people, resources, and ultimately their place in the larger power structure of a fragmented Britain. The title of Bretwalda, literally Britain ruler, was not a formalized office with clear boundaries or powers. Instead, it represented a dynamic, ever-shifting concept of leadership that emerged from the fractured political landscape of early Anglo-Saxon Britain. The Bretwalda was not a hereditary title or an office bound by law. It was an honorific granted to a king who had demonstrated the military power, political influence, and capacity to assert dominance over multiple kingdoms. The role of the Bretwalda was fluid, shaped by the needs of the time and the ambitions of powerful kings. Initially, it was a position acquired through conquest, alliances, and the consolidation of power. The first kings to claim the title were often those who could subdue rival kingdoms and unite disparate territories under their control, even if only temporarily. The Bretwalda's power was not absolute, but was marked by the ability to demand tribute or recognition from other kingdoms.
One of the most significant early figures in the Bretwalda saga was Ethelbert of Kent. His role as one of the first Bretwaldas was pivotal not only because of his military victories, but also because of his strategic use of Christianity. By aligning himself with Rome and allowing missionaries such as Augustine to spread Christianity across Britain, Ethelbert secured political legitimacy both domestically and abroad. His reign highlighted the Bretwalda's dual nature, both a military leader and a unifier of religious and political spheres. The position of Bretwalda evolved as time went on. While earlier kings had established dominance through conquest, later Bretwaldas, like Egbert of Wessex, solidified their power through more strategic methods, focusing on diplomacy, alliances, and careful consolidation. Egbert's rise to power in the early 9th century marked a significant moment in Anglo-Saxon history, as he became one of the most successful Bretwaldas, establishing Wessex as the dominant kingdom in southern Britain. However, the title of Bretwalda was never permanent, and the position's influence ebbed and flowed. It was as much about perception and political maneuvering as it was about tangible power. The title was contested and often passed between kingdoms as leaders rose and fell in the changing tide of Anglo-Saxon politics. As the Anglo-Saxons established their kingdoms, the relationship with the remaining Romano-British elites was complex, marked by both conflict and cooperation. The Romano-British population had, by this point, been marginalized, their Romanized culture gradually fading in the wake of the Saxon invasions. In many regions, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms sought to subdue and replace the Romano-British nobility. In some areas, the Romano-British aristocracy was forced into submission, their lands taken by Saxon rulers. However, this wasn't a blanket policy across the board.
In other areas, especially those further west, the relationship was far more hostile. In Wales and parts of Cornwall, the remaining Romano-British population fiercely resisted the Saxons. These regions, despite their decline under Roman rule, retained a strong sense of identity and a desire to resist foreign dominance. In these areas, conflict between the Britons and the Saxons was not just political, it was cultural. The Saxons sought not only land, but the erasure of the Roman influence, which in some places was met with staunch resistance. The nature of this interaction, whether through conquest, assimilation, or coexistence, varied greatly by region. In the kingdoms of Wessex and Kent, the integration of Romano-British elites helped foster a level of stability and continuity. In the northern and western fringes of the island, however, the relationship was far more adversarial. The growth of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was a slow, dynamic process that evolved over time. The formation of kingdoms like Wessex, Kent, and Northumbria was driven by necessity, survival, and opportunity. These early kingdoms were forged in the fires of conflict, but they also grew through strategic alliances, adaptability, and the gradual blending of cultures. The Bretwalda was not just a title, It was a reflection of the complex and shifting political dynamics that marked early Anglo-Saxon Britain. As for the Anglo-Saxon king's relationship with the Romano-British elites, it was not a simple story of conquest and replacement. While there were certainly areas of violent subjugation, there were also moments of cooperation, assimilation, and coexistence. The long-term impact of these relationships is evident in the way that the Anglo-Saxon political and cultural structures integrated elements of Roman Britain, creating a new, hybrid system that would dominate Britain for centuries to come.
The rise of Mercia as one of the most dominant kingdoms of early Anglo-Saxon England is a tale not just of conquest, but of careful political maneuvering, economic foresight, and ruthless military expansion. Located centrally within Britain, Mercia's success was rooted in its ability to control vital trade routes and natural resources, but it was the aggressive and astute leadership of its kings, particularly Penda and Offa, that truly elevated Mercia to the zenith of power during the 7th and 8th centuries. Mercia's geographical location was one of its greatest assets. The kingdom sat at the heart of Britain, allowing it to control key river systems such as the Trent and Severn rivers, which were vital for trade, communication, and military movement. This made Mercia a hub for commerce and agriculture, creating a self-sustaining economy that allowed the kingdom to thrive in ways that others could not. The Severn Valley, rich in fertile lands, also gave Mercia a substantial agricultural base, making it a key player in feeding the Anglo-Saxon world. Additionally, its position allowed it to act as a buffer zone between Wessex to the south and Northumbria to the north, which made it an influential player in regional politics. However, it wasn't just geography that made Mercia powerful. It was the aggressive military campaigns launched by kings like Penda. Penda, who reigned from 626 to 655, became known for his ferocious expansionist tactics. A skilled military commander, Penda sought to expand Mercia's territory at the expense of neighboring kingdoms, including Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia. His victories on the battlefield enabled him to carve out a vast empire across central England, stretching from the Humber River in the north to the Thames in the south. Penda's military success was not just about brute force, but about his ability to unite various tribes under his leadership. The warbands that fought for Penda were a mixture of Anglo-Saxons and other tribal factions, united by the promise of spoils and land. Penda's reign, however, ended in 655 after his defeat at the Battle of Winwade by the Northumbrians, led by Oswu. Despite his death, Penda's military strategies left a deep imprint on Mercia, which continued to grow under his successors. His aggressive expansion and the territorial conquests he secured helped establish Mercia as a dominant force in southern and central Britain.
The economic growth that followed Mercia's territorial expansion was equally significant. Mercia controlled lucrative trade routes across Britain and developed strong commercial ties with neighboring regions, particularly through its connections to the Frankish Empire and the Irish Sea. Mercian towns such as Tamworth and Lichfield became centers of culture, religion, and trade. As Mercia solidified its position, it became a key economic hub, its influence extending well beyond its military conquests. Mercia's leaders also took advantage of the Christianization of Britain. Offa of Mercia, who ruled from 757 to 796, understood the value of aligning with the Church. His relationship with Pope Adrian I and the Christian Church allowed him to solidify his status as the preeminent Christian ruler in Britain. The Church was not just a spiritual institution, but a political one, and Offa used it to his advantage, establishing alliances that further reinforced his power. One of Offa's most remarkable achievements was Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork that marked the boundary between Mercia and the lands of the Welsh kingdoms to the west.
The dike was a symbol of Mercia's military might and territorial reach. It served as a physical and psychological barrier, cementing Offa's dominance over the neighboring regions and creating a permanent marker of his kingdom's power. The construction of such a vast project demonstrated not only Mercia's military prowess, but its organizational and engineering capabilities, enabling the kingdom to project power for generations. While Mercia dominated for much of the 7th and early 8th centuries, Wessex was beginning to stir in the south. The rise of Wessex, particularly under Egbert, 802 to 839, marked a shift in the balance of power in southern Britain. By the early 9th century, Wessex was in the ascendant, gradually shifting the tides of dominance away from Mercia and towards the southern kingdom. Egbert's military victories over Mercia, including his decisive defeat of Bjornwulf of Mercia at the Battle of Edington in 825, shattered the Mercian grip on central England. Egbert's victory was not merely a military triumph, it was a symbol of the shifting power dynamics between the kingdoms. Wessex's growing dominance marked the beginning of a new political era in Britain, one in which Wessex would eventually outstrip Mercia's influence. Egbert's reign also saw the consolidation of power within Wessex itself. He implemented military reforms that focused on organizing the kingdom's defense systems and fortifying key towns. Egbert's Wessex was not only a military power, but also a kingdom with a more centralized administrative system. Unlike the fragmented, often divided rule of the earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex under Egbert began to create a more unified political structure.
Egbert's rise also coincided with the development of a Christian kingdom in Wessex, an idea championed by his son, Alfred the Great, who would later lead the kingdom to its greatest heights. Wessex's embrace of Christianity and its relationship with the papacy helped secure its legitimacy as a dominant force in southern Britain. The rivalry between Mercia and Wessex was not merely a battle for land, it was a battle for legitimacy, control of trade routes, and political dominance. While Mercia had relied on military conquest and strategic alliances to grow, Wessex, under Egbert, utilized a combination of military success, diplomatic maneuvering, and territorial expansion to undermine Mercia's supremacy. One of the key elements in this struggle for supremacy was the role of Viking invasions. As Viking raids became more frequent during the 9th century, both Mercia and Wessex faced the external threat of the Norsemen. The kingdom's responses to the Viking invasions would ultimately shape their future. While Wessex, under Alfred the Great, successfully repelled the Vikings and solidified its control over southern England, Mercia's response was less cohesive. The lack of strong, centralized leadership in Mercia contributed to its decline, as its kings were unable to mount a sustained defense against the Viking invaders. The rise of Mercia was driven by a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, and economic power, with kings like Penda and Offa shaping the kingdom's early dominance. Mercia's central location and control of vital trade routes gave it a unique advantage, while its expansionist policies and relationship with the Christian Church helped cement its place as a dominant kingdom in early Anglo-Saxon Britain. However, the eventual rise of Wessex, marked by the military genius of Egbert, shifted the balance of power, leading to Wessex's eventual ascendancy over Mercia. The competition between these two powerful kingdoms set the stage for the formation of a unified England, as their rivalry and internal struggles were shaped by the pressures of external invasions and shifting alliances. The rise of Mercia as a dominant force in early Anglo-Saxon Britain was not a singular moment, but the result of decades of aggressive expansion, military victories, and astute diplomacy. Penda, the warrior king of Mercia, understood that power was won not only on the battlefield, but also through alliances, coercion, and control over resources. Mercia, positioned in the fertile Midlands, had a strategic advantage over its neighbors, controlling key trade routes and access to agricultural wealth.
However, it was Penda's military genius that truly set Mercia apart. Penda's reign, 626 to 655, was marked by relentless military campaigns aimed at expanding Mercia's territorial reach. His ability to unite disparate tribes under his banner, including those who had little in common culturally or militarily, was a feat that showcased his prowess not only as a warrior, but as a leader capable of maintaining internal unity. Penda's ambition was not merely to raid neighboring kingdoms, but to create a lasting empire, one that stretched from the Humber in the north to the Thames in the south.
However, Penda's rule was also marked by his paganism in an increasingly Christianized Britain. Unlike Wessex, which was beginning to embrace Christianity, Penda maintained a pagan identity which placed him at odds with the growing Christian influence in other kingdoms. His inability to reconcile his religious beliefs with the increasing power of Christian leaders weakened his diplomatic relations with the Church and other Christian kingdoms, contributing to the eventual downfall of Mercian power after his death. When Offa of Mercia took the throne in 757, he continued Penda's legacy of territorial expansion, but with a more diplomatic approach. Offa's reign marked the height of Mercian power, not only due to military conquests, but also through his political savvy. Offa's alliance with the Pope and his strong relationships with the Frankish kings elevated his standing as a ruler. Offa understood that the Christian Church was a powerful force, and by aligning himself with it, he secured Mercia's legitimacy across Britain. His relationship with the Pope provided the kingdom with political and religious authority, something that Wessex, still struggling with internal divisions, lacked at the time. But Offa's greatest physical legacy, Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork stretching across the border between Mercia and Wales, was also a testament to his territorial ambitions. The dike symbolized not only military might, but also the kingdom's attempt to mark its authority over the neighboring Welsh territories. It was a clear demarcation of Mercia's dominance, an unyielding line that stood firm against both internal and external challenges. In stark contrast to Mercia's aggressive expansionism, Wessex was marked by a more defensive and unifying leadership style. Kings like Egbert and Alfred the Great understood that survival in a fragmented Britain meant not just military conquest, but the consolidation of internal power and strategic diplomacy. Egbert of Wessex, who rose to prominence in the early 9th century, became one of the most important figures in Anglo-Saxon history. Egbert's military campaigns, particularly his victory over Bjarnwulf of Mercia at Edington in 825, marked a crucial turning point in the Anglo-Saxon struggle for dominance. But it wasn't just the victory that made Egbert a notable king, it was his ability to maintain stability and forge alliances that helped secure his kingdom's future. While Mercia relied on territorial expansion, Egbert's approach was more focused on solidifying control over Wessex and creating a unified kingdom. Egbert's reign was characterized by a series of strategic alliances, often formed through marriage, military pacts, and negotiations. He understood that Wessex's strength lay not just in conquering neighboring territories, but in uniting them under a single political entity. His diplomatic success allowed Wessex to rise as a dominant kingdom without the same level of aggression that characterized Mercia.
Egbert's son, Alfred the Great, continued this legacy of unification, but he faced an even greater challenge: the Viking invasions. Alfred, unlike the aggressive kings of Mercia, understood the importance of adaptation. His leadership was defined by the reorganization of Wessex's military, including the construction of fortified burhs, towns, which provided safe havens during Viking raids. These fortifications were not just military structures. They represented a strategic vision for a kingdom that could defend itself and rebuild after repeated invasions. Alfred's ability to balance military defense with religious and cultural development was key to Wessex's success. He embraced Christianity fully, not as a tool of conquest, but as a means of creating internal cohesion and cultural identity. Under Alfred, Wessex's kingship evolved into something more centralized and organized, with a focus on legal reforms, education, and religious unity. The rivalry between Mercia and Wessex was more than just a territorial contest. It was a battle for ideological dominance, driven by cultural, religious, and military tensions. For Mercia, the goal was to assert its superiority through conquest and territorial control. Its kings were willing to expand at all costs, using both force and diplomacy to maintain their hold over central England. The Mercian kings believed in the military supremacy of their kingdom and saw their dominance over southern Britain as an essential step in creating a unified Anglo-Saxon empire. In contrast, Wessex's kings were more focused on internal stability and strategic consolidation. While they recognized the importance of military might, they also understood that a kingdom's true strength came from within. Wessex's defense strategy, led by Egbert and Alfred, involved not just military campaigns, but the fortification of towns, the creation of strong alliances, and the development of infrastructure that could withstand external threats, particularly from the Vikings.
The rivalry between the two kingdoms was driven by a clash of political strategies. Mercia's expansionist ambition versus Wessex's defensive unity. While Mercia's kings sought to spread their power through conquest, Wessex's kings sought to consolidate power through resilience and unity. This ideological divide was reflected in the Viking invasions, which exposed the weaknesses in Mercian leadership and solidified Wessex's role as the defender of southern Britain. The eventual decline of Mercia came about not just through Wessex's military victories, but also through its ability to adapt and reorganize in the face of external threats. Alfred the Great's defeat of the Vikings and his establishment of a more cohesive kingdom marked the beginning of Wessex's dominance over the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In contrast, Mercia's internal divisions, weakened leadership, and inability to adapt to the changing tides of warfare ultimately led to its fall. The rivalry between Mercia and Wessex was more than a battle for territory. It was a contest of vision and leadership. Mercia, with its aggressive expansionist strategies, sought to dominate through military conquest, while Wessex, under leaders like Egbert and Alfred, focused on defense, internal consolidation, and strategic diplomacy. This ideological divide shaped the political and cultural landscape of early Anglo-Saxon Britain, setting the stage for Wessex's eventual triumph. Ultimately, it was Wessex's adaptability, strategic alliances, and internal reforms that allowed it to outlast Mercia, securing its position as the dominant kingdom and laying the foundation for the unification of England. The Vikings were not merely marauding pirates, as the popular imagination often suggests. They were a diverse group of Norsemen, primarily from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, who had spent centuries mastering the art of seafaring. Their ships, capable of traveling vast distances over the open sea, as well as navigating shallow rivers, enabled them to launch devastating raids far from their homeland. The Viking raids were not a random outburst of violence. They were a response to the intricate set of social, political, and environmental pressures building in Scandinavia. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia was a place of stark contrasts. Population pressures, coupled with limited arable land, led to a search for resources and new opportunities. The Norse economy, primarily based on agriculture, was unable to support the growing population. This made raiding a natural response, a way for young men, often without land of their own, to gain wealth, prestige, and status. Raiding also represented a form of social mobility in a rigid, hierarchical society, where resources were scarce and honor was earned in battle. However, the Viking raids were not driven solely by economic need.
The Norse warrior culture, steeped in myths of conquest, glory, and the pursuit of Valhalla, played a role in shaping the Viking psyche. The Viking gods, Odin, Thor, and Frey, glorified the act of battle, encouraging warriors to seek out wealth and honor through violent conquest. The longships, with their impressive speed and maneuverability, became symbols of the Viking maritime dominance, enabling them to strike swiftly and without warning.
But what exactly drove them to Anglo-Saxon England? It was the riches and vulnerability of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that made them irresistible targets. The Anglo-Saxon elite had accumulated wealth through extensive trade, farming, and, importantly, from church treasures. These kingdoms were not as united as they appeared. They were fractured, with numerous kingdoms vying for control. This lack of political cohesion made it difficult for the Anglo-Saxons to mount a coordinated defense against an external threat. The Christian church was also spreading rapidly through Britain, and the monasteries that dotted the coast became symbols of both wealth and Christian sanctity, making them prime targets for the Norse raiders. The first major Viking raid, on Lindisfarne in 739, was a signal that the world had changed. The monastery at Lindisfarne was an ideal target. Not only was it rich in treasures, gold, silver, and relics, but it was isolated and poorly defended. The attack was swift and brutal. The Vikings raided the monastery, taking whatever they could and killing those who resisted. But the impact went beyond the material wealth stolen. For the Anglo-Saxon people, the Viking attack was a shock to their system. The faith that they had in their Christianized world, a world of relative stability and order, was shattered. It marked the beginning of a new era, one where England was no longer safe behind its own borders, but was now vulnerable to the ferocious raids of these seafaring invaders. The initial Viking raids had profound and long-lasting effects on Anglo-Saxon society. First and foremost, they exposed the weaknesses in the Anglo-Saxon defense system. The coastal towns, often unfortified, were sitting ducks for Viking raiders. These raids were methodical, exploiting the Anglo-Saxons' lack of coordination and preparation. While some kingdoms, like Wessex, had centralized forces, others were fragmented, with small localized militias struggling to defend against the Viking onslaught. The lack of strong fortifications in the most vulnerable regions, particularly on the coast, meant that the Vikings could strike, plunder, and vanish long before any real response could be organized. The psychological impact on the Anglo-Saxons was immense. The Vikings were not just invaders, they were symbols of destruction. Their quick, devastating raids struck at the heart of Anglo-Saxon life. The monasteries, often seen as sanctuaries, were desecrated. The very places that represented spiritual order were torn asunder. For the Christian Anglo-Saxons, these attacks weren't just physical blows, they were spiritual wounds. The Anglo-Saxon faith had to grapple with the idea that it was no longer just internal threats, like the pagans of the north, but foreign invaders that could invade the sanctity of their homeland.
As the Vikings targeted key towns, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms realized the need for rapid reform. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, would later introduce strategic innovations in the form of burhs, or fortified towns, which were designed to resist Viking incursions and provide a safe haven for the people. But these reforms, though effective in the long run, came only after years of Viking pillaging and the disintegration of Anglo-Saxon defenses. The raids forced the Anglo-Saxons to rethink their entire approach to defense, military coordination, and even social cohesion. The monasteries were not just targets of wealth, they were also symbols of everything the Vikings were challenging. The religious significance of monasteries like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and York made them especially prized by the Vikings. These sacred places were repositories of wealth, collecting gold, silver, and sacred relics that represented the wealth and prestige of the Christian Anglo-Saxon world. For the Vikings, attacking monasteries was not just about looting, they were attacking the heart of Christian civilization itself. Monasteries were built in isolated locations,
often along the coast or near rivers, making them easy targets for Viking raids. Many monasteries were poorly defended. Their purpose was religious, not military, and lacked the fortifications and protection of military strongholds. These religious institutions often had no standing armies to defend them, relying instead on local militias that could be easily overwhelmed by Viking raiders. The vulnerability of these religious sites made them ideal targets for the Vikings, who could strike quickly, plunder the treasures, and disappear without facing significant resistance. Additionally, the monastery's cultural importance added another layer of significance to their plunder. The sacred relics they held were symbols of Christian faith, making their destruction a powerful statement against the Christianized world that the Anglo-Saxons had embraced. For the Vikings, the destruction of these religious sites was both an attack on the material wealth of the Anglo-Saxons and a symbolic conquest of their Christian faith.
The first Viking raids were more than just a military assault. They were the beginning of a cultural and spiritual disruption that would forever alter the course of Anglo-Saxon England. The Vikings' motivations were driven by a complex mix of economic pressures, social mobility, and warrior culture. Their attacks exposed the weaknesses in the Anglo-Saxon defense system and demonstrated the vulnerability of the Anglo-Saxons to organized, fast-moving invaders. The raids on monasteries were particularly devastating, not just because of the wealth stolen, but because they attacked the very foundations of Anglo-Saxon Christian society. The raids forced the Anglo-Saxons to rethink their defenses, and in time, kings like Alfred the Great would rise to lead the resistance. But the initial raids left a legacy of fear, chaos, and cultural transformation. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were part of a larger cultural shift, one that would reshape the entire fabric of Anglo-Saxon England and set the stage for the eventual Viking settlement and the formation of the Danelaw. The first Viking raids were not just the start of a series of battles. They were the beginning of a new age for England. Born in 849 AD to King Aethelwulf of Wessex and Osber, Alfred was the youngest of 5 sons, a child with little expectation of inheriting the throne. In the early years of his life, Alfred was destined to follow in the intellectual footsteps of his devout Christian family rather than take up arms on the battlefield. His early education focused on scriptural study, literature, and the Christian teachings of the time. His mother, Osber, played a crucial role in nurturing his intellectual curiosity and devout faith. But young Alfred likely never imagined that he would one day be the leader of Wessex in its darkest hour. Alfred's early life, steeped in religious study, was far from the warrior's life his older brothers led. However, fate, as it often does, has a way of rewriting destinies. Alfred's eldest brother, Aethelbald, ruled Wessex after their father's death in 855, followed by Aethelbert and Aethelred. Yet each brother's reign was short-lived, and each faced mounting threats from the Viking invaders that had begun raiding the southern kingdoms. Alfred, though sidelined in terms of succession, would soon find himself thrust into the chaos of Viking warfare when Aethelred died in 871, leaving the crown to Alfred.
Alfred's rise to power came during one of the most difficult periods in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. Wessex, weakened and fragmented from constant Viking incursions, was near collapse. The internal divisions between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, along with the external Viking threat, had created a fragile state ripe for conquest. Alfred, as a relatively unknown prince, was thrust into the leadership vacuum at a time when the kingdom was not only losing land, but also its Christian identity to the pagan Norse invaders. His rise wasn't merely the inheritance of a crown. It was the acceptance of the monumental task of defending Wessex from obliteration. Alfred the Great's leadership was marked by his adaptability and visionary military strategy. Unlike the kings before him, who focused primarily on traditional methods of warfare, Alfred recognized that the Viking threat was unlike any other. The Vikings, Organized into tightly knit groups and propelled by their superior maritime technology, had already shown their ability to devastate coastal towns and plunder wealth across the kingdom. They were ruthless and tactical, using their longships to strike with incredible speed and precision, taking advantage of the Anglo-Saxon system's lack of unification and internal divisions. Alfred's military genius lay not just in traditional battle, but in his ability to adapt Viking tactics to suit Anglo-Saxon needs. His first and most notable victory against the Vikings came at the Battle of Edington in 878. But his military prowess was not born overnight. Prior to Edington, Alfred faced numerous challenges, including his own retreat to the marshes of Athelney after Wessex was overrun by Viking forces. This period of exile was one of the defining moments of Alfred's leadership. Rather than succumb to defeat, Alfred rallied his forces, adapting guerrilla tactics and building a coalition of Anglo-Saxon warriors to challenge the Viking invaders. One of Alfred's key innovations was his use of mobile warfare. Recognizing that the Vikings relied on fast, unpredictable raids, Alfred adapted by building a mobile and flexible fighting force that could strike quickly and retreat just as rapidly. This approach minimized the chances of a protracted siege and maximized the element of surprise. Alfred's men became accustomed to hit-and-run tactics, avoiding direct confrontation with Viking forces when unnecessary, but attacking with precision when the Vikings were vulnerable.
In addition to this mobile force, Alfred reformed Wessex's navy, understanding that the Vikings' dominance on the sea was a major advantage. Under Alfred's command, Wessex built up its own fleet of ships designed to counter the Viking longships. The creation of a naval force helped to protect the kingdom's coastal areas and disrupt the Vikings' ability to launch surprise raids. This was an early example of combined arms warfare, where Alfred effectively integrated land and naval strategies to mount a comprehensive defense. One of Alfred the Great's most significant contributions to the defense of Wessex and to Anglo-Saxon England as a whole was his military reforms and the creation of the burh system. The concept of the burh, a fortified town or settlement, was central to Alfred's defense strategy and became one of his most enduring legacies. The burhs were not just simple fortifications, they were strategic hubs that would play a critical role in the defense of Wessex. Alfred ordered the construction of over 30 burhs strategically placed throughout Wessex. These towns were designed to act as refuge centers for the population during Viking raids, and they provided a unified defensive front against external invaders. The walls of these burhs, combined with garrisons of soldiers and militias, created an almost impenetrable defense that forced the Vikings to reconsider their approach. Alfred's genius was in how he organized the burhs. They were not just military outposts, they were economic and social hubs. Trade continued within these fortifications, and they served as a foundation for community solidarity. People from surrounding areas were encouraged to seek refuge in the burhs during raids, and the fortified towns became a key part of the Anglo-Saxon defense. This was a revolutionary shift from earlier methods of defending a kingdom. Instead of relying solely on the king's standing army, Alfred used the people of Wessex as active participants in their own defense. Each burh was responsible for organizing its own defense, with local militias providing a layer of military protection. Alfred also standardized military training and established a system of local levies, ensuring that the people of Wessex were trained and ready to defend their homes. The burh system also allowed for better logistical support in the event of a Wessex siege. Local militias could mobilize quickly, and the availability of supplies within these fortified towns meant that the defenders could withstand prolonged attacks.
Beyond military strategy, Alfred's reforms were aimed at resilience against not just the Vikings, but the internal divisions that had plagued Wessex for years. By creating a unified defense system and ensuring that every part of Wessex was protected, Alfred created a cohesive kingdom that could withstand external threats. His vision was not just about victory in battle, but about preserving the kingdom's identity and ensuring its survival for generations to come. Alfred the Great's rise to power was a remarkable journey from a marginalized prince to the savior of Wessex. His early life, marked by his intellectual upbringing, prepared him for the intellectual and spiritual challenges of leadership. Yet, it was his ability to adapt and innovate in the face of Viking invasions that defined his reign. Alfred's military strategies were revolutionary, and his reforms, the creation of the burr system, the development of a naval fleet, and the establishment of a strong, organized defense, laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. Alfred the Great's legacy lives on, not just in the victories he achieved, but in the systems he put in place, systems of defense, education, and unity that would shape the future of England for centuries to come. The Viking invasions of Anglo-Saxon England were not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of a profound transformation in Viking society. The Great Heathen Army, which descended on Britain in 865 AD, was no ordinary band of raiders. It was an organized military campaign led by ambitious Viking leaders such as Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Bjorn Ironside. The army's objectives were clear and distinct. This was no longer a force of raiders intent on plundering and disappearing into the night. This was an army with settlement and dominion in mind, marking a fundamental shift in Viking strategy.
The Vikings of the 8th century were renowned for their hit-and-run tactics, where they would quickly descend on coastal villages and monasteries, plundering valuable treasures before vanishing. These raids, while devastating, were often short-lived. The Vikings were primarily interested in plunder, and their absence from the scene was often as abrupt as their arrival. However, by the time the Great Heathen Army arrived in England, the Vikings had evolved into a more structured and unified force. They sought not just wealth, but land they could conquer, settle, and rule. The leaders of the Great Heathen Army were not only warlords, but kings in the making, determined to carve out a kingdom in the heart of Anglo-Saxon Britain. The Viking strategy was no longer just to raid, but to occupy. The longships, previously a symbol of Viking swiftness, became tools for long-term conquest. They could carry large numbers of men and provisions, allowing the Vikings to remain in the country for extended periods. Their invasion was a deliberate campaign aimed at overthrowing Anglo-Saxon rule and establishing a new power structure. By attacking towns like York, East Anglia, and Northumbria, the Vikings created a power vacuum that Alfred, King of Wessex, would need to address. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 was thus not the beginning of simple raids, it was the beginning of a decades-long struggle between Viking invaders and the Anglo-Saxons, with Wessex positioned as the last line of defense. The invaders were in it for the long haul, making their settlements in East Anglia and Northumbria and slowly pushing southward, setting their sights on Wessex. Alfred the Great's military leadership was tested during the Battle of Ashdown in 871, a crucial moment in the struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Great Heathen Army. Alfred's rise to the throne was marked by personal and political turbulence. As the youngest son of King Æthelwulf, Alfred had little expectation of inheriting the crown. However, fate would thrust him into leadership after the deaths of his older brothers, each of whom had ruled Wessex during a time of increasing Viking incursions. By 871, Alfred was king,
But Wessex was under siege, and his forces were exhausted from years of Viking invasions. In the winter of 871, Alfred faced the great heathen army, led by Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, whose forces had already decimated much of the surrounding land. The Battle of Ashdown was one of the first major tests for Alfred, and it was a decisive moment for Wessex. Though the Vikings were more experienced and had a larger force, Alfred's ability to rally his troops and organize a counterattack was key to the Anglo-Saxon victory. One of the key moments during Ashdown was Alfred's personal involvement in the battle. Unlike many rulers of his time, who commanded their forces from behind the lines, Alfred fought alongside his soldiers. His presence in the fray inspired his men, and this personal leadership helped to turn the tide in the Anglo-Saxon favor. The battle was not only a military victory, but also a moral one, as it gave the Anglo-Saxons a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, they saw that victory against the Vikings was possible. Alfred's forces, though fewer in number, used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, outflanking the Viking forces and forcing them into a retreat. The Battle of Ashdown had lasting consequences. It shattered the Viking belief that they were invincible and showed that the Anglo-Saxons, under Alfred's leadership, could stand their ground. However, the battle was just one skirmish in a much longer war. Alfred would need to use both military force and diplomacy to solidify his victory and rebuild Wessex's defenses. But Ashdown proved that the Vikings were not undefeatable, and Alfred's leadership could turn the tide. Alfred's ability to negotiate with the Vikings played a crucial role in his long-term strategy to preserve Wessex. Although Alfred was a fierce and capable military leader, he also understood the strategic value of diplomacy. Throughout his reign, Alfred sought to balance military action with negotiation, and in doing so, he bought precious time for Wessex to recover from Viking attacks. One of Alfred's most significant negotiations came after his victory at the Battle of Edington in 878. This battle, a decisive defeat for Guthrum and his Viking forces, was crucial in the short term for the survival of Wessex. However, rather than pushing for complete annihilation of the Viking forces, Alfred took a diplomatic route. He agreed to a treaty with Guthrum, allowing the Vikings to settle in East Anglia and convert to Christianity. This was a shrewd move by Alfred, as it ensured the Vikings would no longer pose a direct military threat to Wessex, and it also served to establish Christian unity as a foundation for future peace.
In addition to the formal peace treaty, Alfred used these negotiations to buy time to rebuild his kingdom. The burh system, which Alfred had already initiated before Edington, was essential in protecting Wessex from future Viking incursions. By allowing the Vikings to settle peacefully in East Anglia, Alfred ensured that the focus of Viking activity would shift away from Wessex, buying the kingdom much-needed time to fortify its defenses. In the years following the treaty, Alfred worked tirelessly to build a more resilient and cohesive kingdom, one that could withstand future Viking invasions. Alfred's diplomacy did not come without criticism from some of his own people, who may have seen the peace treaty as a concession to the enemy. However, Alfred recognized the larger picture: survival. In the face of ongoing Viking raids, he saw that coexistence, albeit temporarily, was a better option than total destruction. This pragmatic approach allowed Wessex to recover, and it eventually gave Alfred the upper hand in the long-term struggle for control of England. Alfred the Great's reign was defined by a remarkable blend of military innovation, diplomatic skill, and personal resilience. His ability to adapt Viking tactics, fortify Wessex, and negotiate peace while preparing for future conflict made him one of the most successful Anglo-Saxon kings. The great heathen army, with its vast numbers and strategic foresight, had put Wessex on the brink of collapse. But Alfred's leadership, shown through his military victories at Ashdown and Edington, his negotiation with the Vikings, and his ability to rebuild his kingdom, ensured Wessex's survival. Alfred's lasting legacy is not just in the military victories, but in his vision of a unified Christian England.
His legal reforms, military innovations, and social resilience laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England. Alfred, through his diplomacy and military strategy, turned a sinking kingdom into one of the most formidable powers in England. His story is one of endurance, intelligence, and tactical genius, securing his place as one of England's most revered monarchs.
By the time Alfred the Great ascended the throne in 871 AD, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were deeply fragmented. The Viking invasions had wreaked havoc across the land, leaving many kingdoms vulnerable to collapse. The Viking Great Heathen Army, led by figures like Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, had already secured vast swaths of territory from East Anglia to Northumbria, while Wessex, Alfred's kingdom, was a lone beacon of resistance against the Norse invaders. The task that lay before Alfred was monumental, not just to defend Wessex, but to unite the fractious Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a single banner, one that could endure the ever-present Viking threat and secure a lasting peace. Alfred's approach was characterized by both brilliance and pragmatism. Initially, his focus was on securing Wessex by establishing a strong defensive infrastructure. He began constructing burhs, fortified towns, throughout his kingdom. These fortifications were not only military strongholds, but also centers of trade, which helped revitalize the kingdom's economy and increase its military preparedness. The burhs were interconnected, ensuring that Wessex could mobilize forces efficiently in response to Viking raids and offer protection to the population in times of attack. Alfred knew that his success lay not just in military strategy, but in creating a secure and sustainable environment that would foster the cooperation of his people and support their long-term survival. However, securing Wessex was only the first step. To truly unite England, Alfred knew that he needed to engage with the neighboring kingdoms of Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, all of which had suffered under the Viking invasion. Alfred's solution was a mix of diplomacy and military action. He understood that the Viking threat would not simply disappear, and that alliances with local leaders would be crucial to securing a unified defense against the invaders. One of Alfred's most important political maneuvers was his alliance with the Mercian rulers. Mercia was a powerful kingdom, and Alfred's ability to build trust with Mercian nobles was essential for his unification strategy. After the death of Burred, the king of Mercia, Alfred became a de facto protector of Mercia, working to ensure that the kingdom would remain a key partner in the defense of England. His leadership helped maintain peace in the Midlands, ensuring that the Vikings were unable to exploit Mercian weakness to their advantage.
In addition, Alfred's diplomatic engagement with the Viking settlers, such as Guthrum, played a critical role in reducing the immediate Viking threat. After his victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred managed to negotiate a peace treaty with Guthrum, who agreed to settle in East Anglia in exchange for baptism and the establishment of Christianity. This not only provided temporary respite from Viking raids, but also helped in the long-term integration of Viking settlers into Anglo-Saxon society. Alfred's ability to balance diplomacy with military action allowed him to buy crucial time for his kingdom to recover and strengthen its defenses, setting the stage for the eventual unification of England. Christianity played a central role in Alfred's strategy for unification, but not merely as a religious institution, it was also a political tool. By the time of Alfred's reign, the Christian Church had become a powerful force in Anglo-Saxon society, offering both moral authority and cultural cohesion. For Alfred, aligning himself with the Church was essential not just for religious reasons but for political legitimacy. In a period of tribal divisions and constant warfare, Alfred used Christianity as a way to create a shared identity among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Christianity became the glue that held together the political landscape, offering a common language, a shared faith, and a moral framework for Alfred's kingdom. Alfred, being deeply devout, saw himself not only as a military leader, but as the protector of the Christian faith in England. He believed that the survival of England was intertwined with the survival of Christianity, and that the Church would provide both the spiritual foundation and moral guidance for the English people. Alfred's relationship with the Church was one of mutual benefit. He provided protection and land for the clergy, ensuring their loyalty and the loyalty of their followers. In turn, the Church legitimized Alfred's rule, with bishops and monks supporting his efforts to rebuild Wessex and unify England.
Alfred also encouraged the translation of texts into Old English, particularly religious texts, which helped to standardize religious practices across the kingdom and further solidify the Christian identity of England. But Alfred's Christianity was not limited to diplomacy. It was part of his personal vision for a just society. He saw himself as a divinely appointed king whose primary responsibility was not just to defend his people, but to lead them in righteousness. His Doom Book, a code of laws influenced by both Christian teachings and Anglo-Saxon customs, provided a legal framework that prioritized justice, fairness, and the protection of the poor. By embedding Christian values into the laws of the land, Alfred sought to create a society that was morally strong and politically stable, both crucial for the long-term survival of a unified England.
Alfred's reign marked a transformational shift in the concept of kingship in Anglo-Saxon England. Before Alfred, kings were primarily seen as war leaders, warlords who defended their people and led them into battle. While Alfred certainly played the role of a warrior king, his reign saw the development of a more complex and multifaceted idea of kingship. During Alfred's time, kingship evolved from a primarily military function to one that required administrative skills, legal acumen, and social responsibility. Alfred was not just fighting for survival against Viking invaders, he was shaping the future of England. He saw his role as that of a protector, not only of his people, but also of their way of life, their Christian faith, laws, and cultural practices. His kingship thus became legitimate not just through military victories, but also through his efforts to establish a stable, unified kingdom grounded in justice and order. Alfred's kingship also represented a shift from the tribal loyalties of earlier Anglo-Saxon kingship to a more centralized and unified monarchy. His efforts to centralize authority and create a coherent administrative structure laid the foundation for the future English monarchy. The Doom Book was a key part of this process, as it represented an effort to standardize the legal system across Wessex and eventually the rest of England. Alfred's focus on law, education, and defense would become the blueprint for future kings, who would inherit not just the crown, but also the institution of kingship that Alfred had created. Alfred the Great's vision for a united England was not a simple dream. It was the culmination of years of careful diplomacy, military genius, and cultural consolidation. Alfred worked tirelessly to unite the kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia into a single cohesive nation capable of standing against the Viking threat. Through his strategic alliances, military victories, and profound religious commitment, Alfred laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England under a single monarch. His legacy is not just in the victory at Edington or the defense of Wessex, but in the creation of a united identity, one that was built on Christian values, the rule of law, and a strong centralized monarchy. Alfred's reign marked the transformation of kingship from a role focused solely on war to a role that required a monarch to be a protector, lawgiver, and cultural leader. His achievements continue to shape the idea of English kingship, and his legacy as one of the greatest rulers in English history endures to this day.
The Viking Age in England is often seen as ending with the defeat of the great heathen army and the eventual rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but the process was far more gradual than it appears at first glance. The end of Viking rule in England wasn't marked by a single battle or conquest, but by a series of military, political, and cultural shifts that slowly dismantled Viking power. One of the key turning points came with Alfred the Great's victories over the great heathen army at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD. Before this decisive battle, the Vikings had established a foothold in much of England, including the Danelaw, a vast Viking-controlled region covering East Anglia, Northumbria, and parts of Mercia. The Viking forces, led by Guthrum, were organized and formidable, with the goal not just of plundering, but of creating a permanent Viking kingdom in England. After their defeat at Edington, the Vikings agreed to a peace treaty, and Guthrum himself converted to Christianity,
symbolizing the first major cultural shift that would eventually lead to the Vikings becoming part of the Anglo-Saxon fabric of society. While Alfred's victory was monumental in halting the Viking advance, the ultimate decline of Viking power in England would take several more decades. The Viking Age didn't end with a single victory, but through a series of tactical victories, political maneuverings, and the slow assimilation of Viking forces into Anglo-Saxon life. Alfred's diplomacy, alliances, and military tactics set the foundation for a more stable England, but it wasn't until the reign of King Aethelstan, Alfred's grandson, that England was fully united and the Viking threat was effectively eradicated. Aethelstan's victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD marked the final defeat of any organized Viking resistance in England, securing his place as the first king of a truly unified England. The great heathen army, which had been the primary vehicle of Viking conquest in England, began to fracture after Edington. The defeat of Guthrum and his subsequent conversion to Christianity marked the end of the military campaign for much of the Viking force in southern England. However, the Viking presence did not disappear overnight. Instead, it slowly evolved from a military occupation into cultural assimilation.
In the aftermath of Edington, the Danelaw remained firmly in Viking hands. The Vikings who had settled in East Anglia and Northumbria began to integrate into Anglo-Saxon society. The Viking settlers continued to live in their established territories, and over time, they married into Anglo-Saxon families, adopted Anglo-Saxon laws, and contributed to the local economy. This shift from military resistance to cultural integration was a defining feature of the final stages of the Viking Age in England. While the Viking military forces in England were significantly weakened after Edington, the cultural imprint left by the Viking settlers remained prominent. In many ways, the Viking presence continued to shape the social structures, legal systems, and economic life of Anglo-Saxon England. The Viking Great Heathen Army, once the harbinger of terror, eventually became a catalyst for England's transformation into a more multicultural society. Even though the Vikings were defeated militarily, their cultural, linguistic, and political influence remained in England for centuries. The Danelaw served as the heart of Viking influence, and the Viking legacy in the north and east of England remained embedded in the local laws, languages, and even nobility long after the military conflicts subsided. Linguistically, Old Norse had a profound impact on the Old English spoken in the regions of England most affected by Viking settlement. Many words related to law, government, and everyday life have Old Norse roots, words like law, window, and husband, reflecting the depth of Viking influence on the English language. This linguistic legacy helped to forge a distinct identity in regions that had once been Viking-dominated, contributing to a hybrid Anglo-Saxon Norse culture that persisted long after Viking military power was extinguished. In terms of government, the Vikings introduced new political structures and legal concepts. The Danelaw had its own system of laws, many of which were based on Norse legal traditions. These legal systems often emphasized individual rights and land ownership, concepts that would later influence the Anglo-Saxon legal framework. As the Vikings assimilated into English life, many of these legal principles were absorbed into the broader Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, contributing to the evolution of English common law. Moreover, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the English economy. As traders and seafarers, the Vikings helped create a thriving trade network that connected Scandinavia, England, and continental Europe. The trade routes that the Vikings established facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that played a pivotal role in shaping England's economy and culture. The Vikings' influence on maritime law and shipbuilding was particularly significant, as their longships set the standard for future naval expeditions.
The Vikings also had an impact on royal succession in England. The Danish monarchy, particularly the reign of Canute the Great, marked the final integration of Viking and Anglo-Saxon lines. Canute, a Danish king, ruled over England from 1016 to 1035, effectively bringing together the Viking and Anglo-Saxon royal families. His reign, while short, represented the fusion of two worlds, the Viking and the Anglo-Saxon. The Viking influence during Canute's rule was still visible, not only in terms of governance but also in administrative practices and cultural exchange. The Viking Age in England came to an end not with a single defining moment, but through a slow and complex process of military defeat, cultural assimilation, and political consolidation. The great heathen army was defeated, but its legacy endured in the language, laws, and culture of England. Viking influence continued to shape English society long after the last Viking military forces were driven out. Alfred the Great's victories, followed by the long reign of Canute, marked the final stages of Viking resistance and the ultimate unification of England. However, the Vikings' cultural imprint on the country was indelible. The legacy of the Danelaw, the Viking legal systems, the linguistic contributions, and the royal connections all combined to create a unified yet diverse England, one shaped by the centuries of Viking influence that came before. In the end, the Vikings were not just conquerors, they were settlers, traders, and influencers. Their legacy is woven deeply into the fabric of medieval England, and even after their military defeat, the Viking Age continued to resonate throughout English history. The Anglo-Saxons left an enduring mark on the culture, language, and legal systems of England, shaping much of what we recognize as modern British society. The impact of their rule, from the establishment of settled communities to the formation of legal codes, was wide-reaching, laying the foundation for the unification of England and leaving a cultural legacy that persists today. At the heart of the Anglo-Saxon legacy is the language, Old English. While the language of the Anglo-Saxons eventually evolved into Middle English and later into the modern English we speak today, its roots remain deeply embedded in the English vocabulary. Nearly 1/3 of modern English words are derived from Old English, a language rich in both Germanic roots and the influences of the early Christian missionaries. Basic concepts such as day, home, mother, and king all stem from Old English, and even the structure of modern English grammar retains elements of its Anglo-Saxon roots, particularly in the use of the subject-verb-object sentence structure.
Culturally, the Anglo-Saxons brought with them a society built around kinship and community. They created an intricate system of land ownership, with lords ruling over villages and manors. This structure of governance laid the foundation for the feudal system that would later dominate England after the Norman conquest. The mead hall, the communal gathering place for Anglo-Saxon warriors, would evolve into a symbol of loyalty, kinship, and hospitality in later medieval English society. The idea of the lord as protector, someone who ruled over both land and people, would persist throughout English history well beyond the Anglo-Saxon era. Additionally, the art and literary contributions of the Anglo-Saxons have remained central to England's cultural identity. The epic poem Beowulf, likely composed in the 8th or 9th century, remains one of the cornerstones of English literature. The oral tradition of storytelling among the Anglo-Saxons, focusing on heroism, loyalty, and fate, continued to influence English literature well into the medieval period. Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship in jewelry, metalwork, and weaponry also set the standard for high artistry in early English society, influencing later artistic movements and traditions. Perhaps most importantly, the Anglo-Saxon legal system would become the cornerstone of English law. The first formalized codes of law, introduced by King Alfred the Great and his successors, were crucial in shaping the system of justice in England. Alfred's Doom Book, which sought to combine Christian moral teachings with traditional Germanic customs, laid the groundwork for common law, which would later become a pillar of modern English society. The principle of trial by jury, the idea of restitution, and the role of witness testimony were all integral to the Anglo-Saxon system, which influenced the legal systems of many nations to come.
Religiously, the Anglo-Saxons developed their own unique brand of Christianity, one that was both fiercely independent and deeply aligned with Roman Catholicism. This hybrid faith played a major role in shaping the identity of Anglo-Saxon England, setting it apart from both the pagan Norse invaders and the Catholic kingdoms of Europe. The continued strength of the Church and its role in daily life gave England a sense of spiritual unity that would continue well into the medieval period. The Anglo-Saxon period, despite its eventual demise at the hands of the Norman conquest in 1066, laid the foundational groundwork for the unification of England. While the kingdom was not fully unified under one monarch until the reign of Athelstan in the early 10th century, the political and cultural foundations laid by the Anglo-Saxon kings were crucial to the consolidation of England. One of the most important elements in this unification was the military organization and the defensive structures created by Alfred the Great and his successors. The burh system of fortified towns helped to prevent Viking invasions and provided a template for the later feudal system. The idea of a centralized defense, where local communities would work together to protect the kingdom, set the stage for later English unity. Politically, the rise of English kingship through the Anglo-Saxon period laid the groundwork for the centralized monarchy that would follow. The early Anglo-Saxon kings, particularly Athelstan, helped establish a system where the king was seen as the ultimate authority in England, not just a tribal leader, but a ruler of a unified people. By the time of the Norman conquest, the idea of a centralized state was well established, and much of the English political structure that would follow, royal courts, legal traditions, and even the role of the nobility, had been shaped by the Anglo-Saxon experience. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms did not just leave behind a legacy of military and political organization, they also provided a sense of English identity that transcended tribal divisions. The English language, the Christian faith, and the laws of Alfred served as enduring symbols of a unified England, one that was resilient in the face of both internal strife and external invasions.
The Anglo-Saxons may have been replaced by the Normans, but their influence remains deeply embedded in the English identity. From the language we speak, to the laws we follow, to the values that define our society, the Anglo-Saxons' legacy continues to shape the England we know today. Their contributions to culture, religion, and political governance helped lay the foundation for a unified kingdom, one that would evolve and grow into one of the most influential nations in world history. Despite the passage of time, the Anglo-Saxon legacy remains unbroken, woven into the very fabric of England's identity. The Anglo-Saxon period was a transformative time for what would later become England, a time defined by resilience, cultural synthesis, and political experimentation. It began in the wake of the Roman withdrawal from Britain, with the Anglo-Saxons establishing kingdoms that would struggle for dominance. Over time, their ability to adapt and thrive amidst external threats, including the Viking invasions, set the foundation for the unification of England under a single monarchy. The most significant milestones of this era include Alfred the Great's resistance against the Vikings and his strategic reforms, which helped preserve and strengthen Wessex, laying the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. His victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD, along with the peace treaty that followed, marked the first major shift in the Viking tide. Alfred's legacy, from his military strategies to his legal reforms, and his support for learning and Christianity, provided the groundwork for a unified Anglo-Saxon England. The rise of Athelstan, who, through military and political maneuvering, achieved the unification of England in the early 10th century, was another critical moment. Under his reign, England was transformed into a single political entity, an accomplishment that set the stage for the later Norman conquest
and the establishment of an enduring monarchy. However, the Anglo-Saxon story is not solely defined by military victories. The cultural and intellectual achievements of this period, particularly the preservation of Christianity, the integration of Viking culture, and the development of Anglo-Saxon law, have had a lasting impact on modern English society. Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon legal system, and the monastic learning that flourished during this time continued to influence English language, literature, and governance today. The Anglo-Saxon period, though centuries ago, offers valuable lessons for modern society, particularly in the realms of unity, cultural adaptation, and leadership. One of the most relevant lessons from the Anglo-Saxon experience is the importance of unity in the face of division. The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were fractured and often at war with one another, but leaders like Alfred the Great and Aethelstan demonstrated the power of visionary leadership that could forge alliances, consolidate power, and ultimately create a unified state. In today's globalized world, where geopolitical tensions often divide nations, the story of how the Anglo-Saxons overcame their internal divisions can serve as a reminder of how unity is essential for survival and prosperity.
Cultural resilience is another key takeaway. The Anglo-Saxons were initially a pagan society, but they successfully integrated Christianity, which not only reshaped their religious practices, but also provided a moral framework for governance. This adaptation to new ideas helped them maintain stability and cohesion, even as external pressures, such as the Viking invasions, threatened their survival. Today, societies are constantly faced with cultural and ideological shifts, and the Anglo-Saxon ability to adapt and integrate new influences could inspire modern societies to embrace change while maintaining their core identity. Finally, the Anglo-Saxon emphasis on law and governance serves as a timeless lesson in the importance of justice and social responsibility. The legal codes established by kings like Alfred the Great laid the groundwork for many of the principles that underpin modern legal systems, such as trial by jury and the rights of individuals. In an era where many countries are striving to strengthen their institutions and uphold the rule of law, the Anglo-Saxon commitment to justice offers both a model and a reminder of the importance of a just and equitable society. Now that we've explored the Anglo-Saxon legacy, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the Anglo-Saxon story did you find the most fascinating? Was it their resilience in the face of Viking invasions, their efforts to unify England, or perhaps their legal innovations that helped shape the future of English law? Or maybe it was their ability to adapt to Christianity while preserving their cultural roots. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons from the Anglo-Saxon period do you think are most applicable to our world today? And if you're enjoying this deep dive into English history, be sure to subscribe so you can continue exploring the rich tapestry of the past with us. Let us know in the comments, what topics would you like to explore next? Thank you for being part of this journey through Anglo-Saxon England, and I look forward to hearing your insights.